Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/historyfangirl. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Kindle, Android, or MP3 player. Hi, I'm Stephanie Craig. Welcome to the History Fangirl podcast. This is episode 48, Atlanta's Ponce City Market. One of the interesting things about the city of Atlanta is how it's always having to change and adapt to the world around it. Sometimes it goes kicking and screaming, and sometimes it forges its own path. Because it's gone through arguably more major cultural and economic changes than most large American cities, it's a unique place to study the evolution of American life. For today's episode, we're taking a peek at the old Sears Roebuck building, now the Ponce City Market. This is a great opportunity to examine how commerce changed rural life, how innovative companies also left their landmark on their city's architecture and culture, and how yesterday's hot new business model becomes today's dinosaur. Further, the evolution of the building into one of Atlanta's newest and hottest spots shows how the legacy of these companies can outlast their actual lifespan if cities and organizations choose to invest in the infrastructure they left behind. My guest today is Caroline Eubanks, a freelance travel writer whose book This Is My South will come out this fall. We chat about how Sears came to Atlanta in the 1920s, what happened during the 60-ish years that Sears operated out of the building, and what kind of legacy the Sears Roebuck building, now the Ponce City Market, has left in its neighborhood and the city. My guest today is Caroline Eubanks. She is a freelance travel writer and author of the website and the forthcoming book, This Is My South. Hi, Caroline.
Hi.
Well, today we are going to talk about the Sears Roebuck building, which is now the Ponce Market.
Yes, Ponce City Market.
The Ponce City Market in Atlanta. And basically you are a expert on all things South, all things travel in the South. And why did you pick this building as something you thought would be interesting to focus on?
It's kind of an example of what's happening in Atlanta. I've lived in Atlanta most of my life. I was born in the suburbs, and it kind of showcases one of the few historic buildings that we've kept. The city tends to demolish anything that's 20 years old. So the fact that it's been there for so long is a huge deal, partially because it would be so much effort to tear it down. It's massive. I think it's 2 million square feet.
Oh, wow.
It's just insanely big. Yeah. And I like the idea of the adaptive reuse and that kind of thing that's happening all over the city, but really had its roots in the Ponce City Market project.
So let's back up a little bit. So you mentioned that the building is very old, especially very old for Atlanta, which was a city that was famously burned during the Civil War. So there's a lot of the old antebellum stuff that wasn't destroyed during the Civil War is gone, but there was also efforts to specifically destroy Atlanta. When does the Sears building pop up, and kind of what's going on in Atlanta at the time that something this big and important was happening there?
Yeah, so a lot happened in Atlanta in the late 1800s, early 1900s. There was another fire after the Civil War. I think it was in 1916, and it burned a lot of this neighborhood as well. So that's kind of why it's the main building around in that neighborhood. So around, I think, the 1860s, it was like a little retreat. There was these natural springs called Ponce de Leon Springs, okay, and named for the explorer. And people would kind of come here for the day, spend the afternoon, and then take the streetcar back home, which was how the whole city was connected at that point. So I think it was maybe in the early 1900s, there was an amusement park here. And then Sears built this massive building in, I think it was 1925. So it wasn't 2 million square feet originally. They kind of added on in pieces as they needed it. But it was It was brought to Atlanta to be the Sears Roebuck Southeastern headquarters because a local business owner was trying to bring in new jobs and everything after Reconstruction and in a time of a kind of transition in the city. So that was the big industry that came to town.
One of the things that I thought was really interesting because, so when you said, let's talk about this building, and I love Atlanta. I've been to Atlanta a lot. I haven't been to this specific building, but it's one of those things where Sears is such an iconic business. Like you think of like those Sears mail order houses that show up in the prairie. And what does Sears mean to America at the time? And what does it mean to Atlanta that Sears has decided to put this headquarters, the Southeast headquarters, in the city?
So the company started as a mail order business, and that's what really affected the South because, there's still a lot of rural areas where you don't have immediate access to stores. You're not going to drive a couple hours to go buy, at the time it was farm equipment, clothing, food, whatever. So the fact that they did these rural deliveries made a huge difference in the business. So having their headquarters in Atlanta made total sense for them so that, they could reach these remote areas in Georgia and the rest of the South with the equipment that people were ordering.
And this kind of it changed the way that people were able to get modern goods.
Yeah, definitely.
So what does it mean to the city that they've decided to, so just as an example, everyone right now is talking about, where is Amazon going to put their headquarters? Or you'll see a city but you'll see cities and states bend over backwards to bring business to them. So what is it like? It seems like it had to have meant something to Atlanta at the time to be this iconic American business, to be one of their homes.
Yeah. So the local entrepreneur, Ivan Allen Sr., he had teamed up with the Atlanta Chamber of Commerce, and they were really, reaching out to these big companies, trying to get them to put their headquarters in Atlanta to bring in all these jobs. So they ended up getting Sears and General Motors. And General Motors had a plant on the southern side of Atlanta. So yeah, they were just really trying to make that happen.
I really can't think of two more iconic American businesses from the 20th century than Sears and General Motors.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's kind of the big two.
So let's talk a little bit about what Atlanta was like in the 20s and 30s when this is all getting started and the building's opening.
So the city was kind of in a big transition. There was still a lot of segregation. The amusement park that was there before the Sears building was segregated. The Sears building itself was segregated. So, the Black-owned businesses were kind of limited to certain parts of town. They called it the color line. It was Auburn Avenue, which is what today is known as Sweet Auburn, which is a historic district where Martin Luther King Jr. grew up. The tension was high. There was a lot of, in 1906, there were race riots that were mostly brought on by newspapers that were either making up situations or they were embellishing to kind of get people afraid and anxious and all of those kind of things. And the Old Fourth Ward, where the Sears building is now, was one of these areas where there were Black-owned businesses. And so they were kind of affected by these riots and the tension going on.
So when you say they were affected by it, so one of the things that I talked to, I did an episode about Black pioneer communities in Ohio. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that Annalisa talked about on that episode was how the Klan came in and targeted Black-owned farms. And then a lot of times when you get racial tension, what you really that seems like it's pure prejudice. A lot of times if you look a little bit further, it's really white people and white anxiety about Black-owned resources and Black-owned businesses. Is that anything that we see in Atlanta at the time?
Yeah, that was definitely part of it because a lot of the Black-owned businesses were being targeted by, protests and looters and things. So that was definitely a problem.
So when Sears comes in, what is actually like, so what, what kind of business are they doing there? And what kind of events or anything is happening in the building or with the Sears community in Atlanta?
So Sears started opening retail stores. They were just mail order before, and they opened their first retail store in Chicago in 1925. And so the Sears building in Atlanta opened in 1926, and it was their regional headquarters managing all of the Southeast. It was a retail store, and it was also offices. So, and warehouse where they kept a lot of the items that ended up being shipped out. So something unique about the building was the train line actually ran through the building.
Oh,
like
wow.
almost like you would see a subway platform now. So it kind of drove under the building. They would unload the merchandise and then it would keep going. So like obviously the railroad is massively important in Atlanta, or was at a certain time, and that definitely helped their business. So they also, like I said, the reason they moved to Atlanta was because they wanted to appeal to farmers that were in the rural parts of the state. So they had their own agricultural foundation, and they would do events like a radio show that was kind of like the Grand Ole Opry, that had like bluegrass and string music. They had a weekly farmers market. They had all sorts of things that were to appeal to certain people.
So that's kind of interesting. I didn't realize that this popped up like as Sears was changing, because it's funny to think now, like now that there are so many Sears closing down, it's funny to think of the time when like the retail store was new.
Right. Like when that was the thing that it was scary to branch out to, was having a retail store instead of like the mail order. It's kind of gone full circle at this point.
Yeah. Except like, I guess people don't really want to leave, whether it's 10 minutes or 2 hours. We don't really like to leave our house if we don't have to.
Yeah, I definitely don't.
So a lot of times one of the things I like about specific buildings is sometimes there'll be like interesting stories or like, funny things that take place in those buildings. Was there anything that stood out to you in your research about this building?
I'm sure there were a lot, but my grandmother actually worked in that building.
Oh, wow.
So she was 18 years old and she was newly engaged. It was 1961. And so she was working in the basement around Christmas, filling the mail orders, getting them sent out, and all of that had to get done around the holidays.
Oh, cool. How long did she work there?
I don't think it was very long. It might have been seasonal or just for a year or so, probably until she got married. So I would say maybe a year. But yeah, she has memories of being in that building and how massive it was and all that.
That's amazing. So one of the things, so we're going to talk about kind of like the decline and the change, but is there anything interesting about the architecture of the building? What style is it and what do you particularly like about it?
I think one of the defining features is the water tower. It's kind of like the tallest part of the building and it has an American flag on it if you look up pictures of it. And that's something you can see pretty much through the whole city on that side of town. It really stands out because that neighborhood it's developed, but they aren't that tall of buildings. So that's kind of the highest point in the neighborhood. They might still have the tank, but I don't think it still has water in it. But that was the main focal point for a long time.
So we have this building and it's kind of a big, important part of commerce in the city and in the region. And you said your grandmother worked there in the 60s. What happens in the 70s that changes? Because by the 80s, it's not the Sears building anymore.
Right. So it happened all over the city. It happened all over the country. It's white flight. Everyone starts moving out to the suburbs. No one wants to go into the city to shop anymore. It used to be that was where you went to buy things. Like, there weren't these suburban shopping malls. So as that started to develop and Atlanta just grows rapidly, everyone keeps getting pushed further out. And it just became, I guess it became too expensive to run. And eventually they closed the retail section of it in 1979. And then they eventually closed the offices in 1987. So then it became totally unused, and the neighborhood kind of changed a lot. The highway kind of cut off access to that neighborhood, to the Old Fourth Ward. So that definitely didn't help in terms of access to the Sears building.
Okay. So as it's not abandoned, but like as Sears leaves, what happens to the building?
It sat vacant until 1990. So it wasn't vacant that long, but the city of Atlanta bought it. I think they bought it for $12 million, and it's still one of the largest buildings in the U.S. by volume. So they buy this 2 million square foot building thinking, we're going to have all these offices for different city employees and everything. And they do more or less, but it ends up being that they use maybe the first 2 levels and the rest are just empty and kind of have been left how they were when Sears moved out. So they had a couple events there, had like a flower show and a few other things, but for the most part, the upper floors just were left alone. The city used their few parts of the lower floors, and they kept doing that until 2010, and they just decided it wasn't really worth it to keep that building anymore.
Okay, so then so you mentioned now that it's not even called the Sears building anymore, it's called the Ponce City Market. How does it go from a municipal building, which is kind of boring, even though some of the best buildings in America are owned by cities, but how does it go from that to something that's usable and an interesting point in the city again?
So a developer named Jamestown, they're very well known in the U.S. They developed Ghirardelli Square in San Francisco. They developed Chelsea Market in New York City. Some of these, insanely successful retail and multi-use spaces they have redeveloped. And so they bought the building from the city for $27 million, much more than the city bought it for. And they had this vision of this kind of work, play, live, this whole city, for lack of a better word, within itself. And so they started developing it. I think maybe they broke ground in like 2012, 2013. And so I got to go on like a hard hat tour in 2013 when it was still really just a shell of a building. They had kind of cleared out some of the junk, and it was really just, you could see what it was going to become, but it was really hard to picture their vision and like how that would happen because it had just sat empty for a while. And I don't know, it was just really hard to imagine it being anything other than what it was. But then I think it was 2014, they opened it as Ponce City Market with retail, dining, offices, and residential. And it's just become this insane success.
So when, let's say you go there with your friends or something, like what do people do there now?
There's so many things. So they've got a whole section. It's a destination in itself. Like I'm not one of those people that wants to go to like a mall and walk around, but it's so much more than that. So they have like retail, they have big name chains like Anthropologie and J. Crew. They have some independent stores. There's like this place called Citizen Supply that has these smaller boutique-y brands of like locally made goods, stuff like that. And then they also have this food hall that is like a fancier food court, like a fancy mall food court. All these chefs got involved pretty early on, way before they knew it was going to be as successful as it was. So, Sean Brock from Charleston, he has a restaurant there. Linton Hopkins, who's a big Atlanta chef, has a couple of restaurants there. And then Jonathan Waxman has one as well. So it's really like, if you want to try the city's best restaurants, but you don't have a lot of time or you don't, want to make a reservation, this is where you can get a taste of what's happening in kind of a quick bite. There's also offices. MailChimp has their offices there.
Oh,
there's
wow.
They're a big Atlanta company. There's a rooftop. It has a restaurant, bar, an amusement park where I actually spent my birthday last weekend.
Oh, happy birthday.
Thank you. It's got great views of the city. They've got all these rides. One of the interesting things that they do is they have all these kind of callbacks to the Sears building. So, like, there's a rooftop bar called RFD Social that is it uses the name of the radio show that was recorded at the Sears building. 9 Mile Station is the name of a restaurant up there, and that was the name of the streetcar station that stopped right there. There's a coffee shop called Spiller Park, which was the name of the baseball stadium that was across the street from the building. You know, they used all of these elements in the decor, like they still use the freight elevators. They have all these kind of mechanical items that were used in the building that they've just placed around the food hall that are just, I don't know, they're just really interesting. It's kind of like a museum walking around there that I think is really cool.
That's one of the things that I think is interesting about Atlanta is like the periods of its history, like, because a lot of stuff is obviously like Civil War or pre-Civil War stuff, but the 1920s to 1940s, it was a very interesting place. And it's fun to see that part of it celebrated a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's done a lot of interesting things for the neighborhood. Obviously, it's been so successful and, you know, raised the prices of rent in so many ways. So there's that element, but the building is located on the Beltline, which is a Rails to Trails project that has also been wildly successful. And it runs along the backside of the building. So you can get to other parts of town. You can get to Midtown. If you live in Ponce City Market, you can hop on your bike or walk or whatever and just get down to another part of the city. And it kind of follows the former streetcar lines. And so it's an interesting connection back to that as well.
So when you say it raises the rent, has there been issues with gentrification, like with the project?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the neighborhood's definitely changed a lot. I grew up going down there to go to concerts, and I would see the mostly abandoned building. There were a lot of empty lots over there. It's definitely changed and has become expensive. But I wasn't really aware of what the neighborhood was like before. I kind of came in from the suburbs, and I would go to see a band, and then I would go home. So I definitely think it has been a problem, but since I didn't live there, I don't feel like I could speak to that.
Yeah, it's one of those interesting things. So I do this other show with someone that you and I both know, Chris Mitchell. So he and I have a podcast about, we have a podcast where we watch episodes of Rick Steves and then we talk about them. And on the episode about Copenhagen, the main like tourist drag in Copenhagen, like basically that exact same process happened there. And it's just one of those things where it's like there are positives and negatives, and you really don't know at the end of the day if the project is worth the negatives. You can't know, but at least if you go there and you enjoy it, at least if you're aware that there are negatives and that there may be like people displaced or businesses displaced because of it, like at least you can be a more responsible person as you like go about your day. And it's just like projects are always hard like that because there are always consequences.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that. But it was important to do something with this massive building that, had just been sitting there. But I guess putting in apartments that are like $1,000 a month for a studio, I don't know. We still are kind of waiting and seeing what happens with all of that. I think I don't know. I think we're going to have to watch it over the next couple of years because Atlanta is still growing like crazy. And at some point, enough's going to be enough. Like we can't develop anymore because it just grows astronomically every year.
Well, Atlanta's so like big, like land wise,
mm-hmm.
that I'm sure that is also an issue too for development because you put in if there's a lot of different places that are very expensive to live, but they're very spread out. You can't say that they should cost that much because everyone wants to live in that exact neighborhood.
Right. Yeah.
So is there anything else before we move on to talk about your book and some other Atlanta travel info? Is there anything else about the building that someone should know if they want to visit it, or just if they're interested in the history, that specific type of 20th century history, which I find fascinating?
Yeah, I mean, I do too. I think people should go. Like, I would never tell someone that they shouldn't go. It's definitely kind of yuppie, but I go all the time. I like the restaurants and bars there. I go meet friends. I park there to go walk on the Beltline. So it's still a big part of the Atlanta experience. I would say be sure to go to the Ponce de Leon Avenue side of the street, because you can kind of see the original facade that still says Sears on the front. That's pretty cool.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and what else? Oh, I would say don't go on the weekends because it's just insanely crowded, but that's just a personal suggestion.
So let's say someone's come in Atlanta for a couple days and they want to go there maybe for like dinner. What else would you suggest? Because I think I've been to Atlanta probably 6 times. I still don't think I have a good idea of what somebody should do with what's the best use of a couple days in Atlanta where you get the most out of the city.
I think if I don't know, all of my suggestions have to do with food, so that tells you exactly what kind of place it is. I think you definitely need to visit some of the civil rights landmarks. I mean, you can't not go to Sweet Auburn. That neighborhood is so full of history. You know,
and
you
the
have
food
to go
there
to
is really good too.
Oh my God, yeah. So a friend of mine runs a food tour through that neighborhood, Atlanta Food Walks, and you go to, you know, the soul food restaurant where different civil rights leaders would plan marches, and you go to the Curb Market that was a segregated market for a long time and is today like a food hall and also an active, you know, market selling produce and meat and all of these things in what would otherwise be a food desert. So it's still an important part of the community. So I think that's a pretty cool way to spend the day. The Center for Civil and Human Rights downtown is a fantastic museum, and it talks about not just the civil rights movement and Atlanta's role in that, because Atlanta obviously had a massive role in that, but, you know, modern civil rights struggles, human rights, all of that kind of stuff. So I think that's definitely a museum you have to visit.
Yeah, I think that is one of the things that the civil rights movement did exceptionally well, was connecting to other rights movements around the world and really making you feel that the struggle is not over, because it can't be over, and there's no one group of people that can achieve anything and then say the struggle is over. And you really feel that when you're in the South and you go to the places where the civil rights movement is like active or celebrated.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that museum has that's really interesting is, you know, they have different exhibits on, like, you know, LGBT rights, and that Atlanta's actually a really big, for lack of a word, gay city. I mean, I forget which publication voted Atlanta one of the top cities. There's a lot of panels on immigrant rights, and Atlanta has one of the largest immigrant communities and refugee communities in the region. I mean, it all ties back together in a really interesting way. So that's definitely one to see.
Now, let's talk a little bit, so as a travel writer, I find you pretty fascinating because you do things. So I've interviewed several travel bloggers on the show, and I think that your career is just really interesting and cool. And 2, you've decided to focus on the South, which I think was a pretty underserved area of American tourism information until maybe recently, or it probably still is even underserved. Yeah. What made you decide to like hunker down and focus on celebrating your region?
I lived overseas after college. I went to college in South Carolina, so I've more or less lived in the South forever. I lived in Australia, and the the misconceptions that people have about the South, even other Americans, were just so crazy to me. Like, you know, this guy from Ohio said he was surprised to see I still had my teeth. You know, my parents have been to New York, and someone asked about their crops. Like, it's just crazy to me how people still picture this part of the world. And, you know, there are some big cities They're very diverse cities. And while you'll still find, yes, you can still go to a plantation, or you can go, you can do all of these things that are maybe a negative interpretation of the South. There's so many, I think, more interesting things happening beyond that. There's young people living here and changing the way that things are happening here. And I think that's really cool. So I wanted to write about the places that no one was writing about. And I also wanted people to kind of be surprised by different elements of life in the South.
Yeah. So I think, one, it's hard to go to Atlanta, Nashville, Birmingham and be like, this is like the rural South, because these are really vibrant cities and Atlanta is huge. And, but at the same time, like, I don't think people outside of the South really differentiate. And this is the third or fourth episode of this show that I've done about the South specifically. So we did the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute and the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. We did the Margaret Mitchell House. And I think whatever episode of Southern history you're talking about, like even today, we've touched upon like economic issues, race issues. There's still no story in any city is great. And I feel like the South gets denigrated for having more dark history than the rest of America, when really, when you go there, I feel like there's so many educational places and institutions designed to walk you through it in a way that is really healthy. And I always learn more I learn so much about the way that America is now whenever I go to the South, because you guys just have really great institutions.
Yeah, I think those are all good examples. Like the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute is just incredible. Like, I think at least these bigger destinations there's no way to hide it. You're not going to pretend like it didn't happen. They're really telling the story in an important way. And I think that's something you definitely have to do if you visit the South, is come to these museums and institutions that really tell it in an honest way. So
now you're working on a book. So as a freelance writer, you've written for some really cool publications, and I won't list any. I'll let you list a few if you want, because I don't know which ones are I don't know what's on your CV, but I just know of some like really big publications that you've been published in. But how did this book come about, and why don't you tell us a little bit about it, so when it comes out later, we can all pick it up.
So I started my website. I've been blogging for, I don't know, 9 or 10 years. I started my second website, This Is My South, maybe 5 years ago, when I was trying to write more about the South and why people should go there. So I got contacted by a publisher about turning it into a book. And so I started working on that last summer. I'm still kind of working on it right now. It is available for pre-order if you search for it. It's called This Is My South. It's basically a guidebook to the southern states. So I think 10 states is what I ended up covering. And I wanted to focus on something that won't be in every book. So it's the big attractions in every city, like World of Coca-Cola in Atlanta, whatever. But it's also some maybe unusual ones. It might be like there was a museum devoted to ventriloquism in Kentucky that I covered.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So just some weird stuff. And I also wanted to have a couple of like responsible travel elements, and then also some unique accommodations. So, not your big chain hotels, either historic hotels or like glamping, yurts, all that funky stuff that is just really unique here. I kind of wrote stuff wanting people overseas to read it, or people who weren't familiar with the South, but it's ended up being a lot of people who aren't used to seeing their area represented, that are like, oh, you're in Mississippi. I live in Mississippi. You should go here, there, whatever. People like making suggestions to your itinerary if you're traveling in this region, which I really like.
Yeah. That's so, the website Camels and Chocolates, I think.
Oh yeah.
Everyone knows it. But so, I don't know Kristen Luna personally, but like we've interacted online and we've like chatted online and stuff. But every time she writes about Oklahoma, because she writes a lot about like destinations in the United States that people wouldn't necessarily know to think about. And I know she worked with the Oklahoma City Tourism Board. And every time she writes about Oklahoma, my mom shares it. And it's that kind of thing. It's like my mom's not a tourist in Oklahoma City, but she will share anything she sees that is really well done about the state because it's just undercovered. So that completely makes sense to me that you have a huge Southern following.
Yeah. And she's great about, obviously she lives in the South too, and just loves covering places that aren't on people's radars. That's really great.
So let's get back to the book a little bit. So it's available for pre-order now. When will it be available? And is it going to be like, I guess, like what formats is it going to be in?
So it should be out in September. It got pushed back a little bit, so I might have to confirm that with you later. But yeah, it's also called This Is My South. It will be in print and I believe Kindle ebook formats.
Awesome. So what we'll do is in the show notes to this episode will be a link to my website because I don't tend to put book links in the show notes just because Amazon is weird. But on my website, there'll be a link. So if you're hearing this episode because you're planning a trip to the South and you want to pre-order or order it once it's out, you can go in and order it. But so just go to my website and there'll be a link to the book for the rest of the time.
Cool. Wonderful.
So any final words? What would one thing you would want people to know about the South before they get there if they're going to dip their toe in for the first time?
I think just not making up your mind before you go. I think you might be surprised at the whole experience. I think obviously I would never say that there aren't negatives to living here and, there aren't people who are kind of stuck in time in a negative way. But I think that for the most part, there's really exciting things happening here. We've got a lot of tech industries. We've got a lot of things happening that I think makes it worth visiting. So I'd say just come and find out for yourself and eat a lot of food. There's no way around it.
And I know you mentioned this before, but just once again, where can people find you?
You can find me at thisismysouth.com. All of the social medias at This Is My South. Or you can just Google my name and probably all of my work will come up because I'm one of very few Caroline Eubankses. So it's probably me.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And later, after the book's out, we should find another cool place in the South to talk about.
Yeah, I would love that. Thank you so much.
I want to say thank you again to Caroline Eubanks for coming on the show. Check out her website, This Is My South, and pre-order her book, which, as you know, comes out this fall. And then if you're going to be doing any travel in this American South whatsoever, definitely head to her website because she is the expert. Housekeeping. Thank you all for your patience the last 3 weeks while I wasn't able to record. Hopefully you enjoyed the bonus episodes I added for you all during the time. And if you did enjoy them, make sure to subscribe to both. So one was a teaser episode from my other podcast, which is Rick Steves Over Brunch. And then Drew Varenkamp's excellent show, which I was guest on, called The Wonders of the World podcast. They're both excellent. Subscribe to both. I promise if you love history and if you love travel, neither of them will disappoint you. And thank you so much for listening.